Welcome to A Lovely Wallpaper, a podcast exploring an underappreciated way of appreciating poetry by committing it to memory. To know a poem by heart means having a worry stone, a provocation, a comfort, a quick exit, always close at hand. Lose yourself in a poem, gain a world with its mastery.
The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that a loss is no disaster.
In this episode, we will work with the helpful voice of Selma Asotić, who is a bilingual poet from Sarajevo. Her new book, Say Fire, explores the long-term fallout of the Bosnian War as it lives on in families, cities, bodies, and psyches. She will be presenting Try to Praise the Mutilated World by Adam Zagajewski. Selma's beautiful book came to my attention because it was published this fall by the wonderful New York translation press, Archipelago. While the text is new to English, Selma actually first published it in her native language, Bosnian, in 2022. She is in good company, Nabokov, Beckett, Calvino, as a bilingual self-translator. When the book arrived in the mail, I opened it first by chance to a short poem, Assimilation. In this fully realized scene that reaches deep back into the brain and into the past, the narrator forgets the word for her order at a coffee shop. The poem immediately floored me with lines like, I'm sorry to say, the word invades me. His look is a sealed envelope. Here, the river overthinks itself into a sheet of ice. This moment of blankness sends the narrator back to a memory of a grandma offering another forgotten word for a flower. A pop of syllables still going off somewhere in my mind. If only I wasn't so unburdened, emptied of explosions. If war and the memory of it is a burden, exile is a terrible form of unburdening. I'd read this whole excellent poem, but I have Selma here, and there are many poems I'd like to hear in her voice. Welcome, Selma.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks for having me.
Where are you calling in from today?
I'm sitting in Northampton, Massachusetts. I'm not sure if there are other Northamptons in the U.S., and I'm looking out my window at the foliage.
Very nice. I'm so excited to be talking with you about your book, Say Fire, today. That is a heavy command. I love this title. Tell me a little bit about this multivalent instruction.
This manuscript, in one of its initial iterations, had the working title of Epistles with Bullets. I kind of like the pistol thing. And then I think I went through a couple of other options, but nothing was really, nothing stayed. And then this comes from one of my favorite poems in the book. And I feel that that particular poem, for me at least, is like a very important anchor. I'm not sure if the way that this book is laid out, the English version, it comes in the middle, but I kind of placed it somewhere in the middle. It might not be, the correct mathematical middle, but I wanted to be somewhere in there because for me, it was almost like a manifesto of sort, although I don't really like speaking of manifestos and in manifestos. And then I wanted a title that has power behind it. And then this is just one of the lines from the poem, Say Fire. And I liked this imperative because I feel that this is what the poetic voice in the book is constantly trying to do. She's trying to break free from all of these constraints and speak. And so it's really not even directed at the reader. It's directed at myself, or this poetic figure is talking to herself when she says, say fire, or she's imploring herself to say the things that are difficult and that need to be said. So I just kind of picked out this line and I think it worked. And I think other people then told me that it worked for them too. So then it just stayed as the title of the collection.
All right. Yeah. The poem that you're talking about that it comes from is one of these kind of epistolary poems. It's the No One Writes Home. It's a letter going back to Bosnia, back to your mother, maybe?
Yes.
And yeah, I guess if you look at the full line, Instead of comfort, let me say fire. So kind of the book is organized around this opposite too. You shy away from easy resolutions and assumptions that things will always get better, that, time heals all wounds, or any platitude like that. Comfort.
Yeah, I think for me, the book is really a repudiation of this vow of silence that I was raised into accepting as the norm. The book is also my public coming out. It's also the first time that I, as a poet, have spoken about some of the formative events in my life, like the Bosnian War and the aftermath. And I've said this many times before, both back home and here in the US, when talking to people about this book, that, I was born in 1992, 2 months before the war, and I was an infant and a toddler when the war finished. I was maybe, 3.5, 4 years old. But I do have some memories from that period, and I know for sure that some of the things that I've dealt with later in life are rooted in that early period. But as a poet, I've always refused talking about the war because I felt that this isn't my topic, that it happened to somebody else, that it wasn't really a topic of my generation. I also didn't want to produce a book that would fall into this category of war literature, because that category was just suffused with such, aggressive, violent nationalism. And it was just a literature that I didn't want to be a part of. And I just thought that, war was something that soldiers and ex-soldiers and those who were cognizant, aware of the world as it was happening, that's what they need to write about, and I'm going to write about something else. And so while I was living in Bosnia, I never wrote about the war and never even thought that war would be a big topic, a big theme in my work. And then I emigrated and moved to the US, and it's here that I actually started writing some of these poems. And then it's through the act of writing the poems that I realized that, yeah, this actually is my theme. This is a topic that I need to address. So it was really like breaking this new ground that had been this kind of area of myself that was really shrouded in darkness and silence. So I think much of the book is sort of this, insistence on speech, uncomfortable speech, which, what is poetry other than uncomfortable speech? So yeah, that's why I singled out this poem as kind of programmatic.
Right. Would you mind, just to get us into the psychic world of your book a little deeper, would you mind going ahead and reading the first poem of the book, Landscape with Footprints in Ash?
Sure. Landscape with Footprints in Ash. You must leave for the story to begin, is what fairy tales taught me. I left. My ghosts now trail behind and weep. I try to comfort them. At night I place a bowl of milk on the terrace. I promise a trip to the sea. They disappear. When I'm alone in the room, all catastrophes are easily traceable. I bury my mind, useless mill churning voices, plastic straws, bills, hands demanding to give and give and give. My own hands I fling down the river. At the estuary, they remember everything. In my head is a circle farm. If I die this very moment, no one will finish what I set out to say. What will you do then, my misery? Already August. In heat, things expand. So do minutes. Fire swallows trees, entire forests. At some point, there won't be anything left to burn. Fire has no future. What a relief for the fire.
Thank you, Selma. I love this line, in my head is a circle farm. Circles are everywhere in your book, right? I think this line comes back in another poem, that there's a circle farm in your head, and you see it in everything from like the ash chasing itself around your aunt's cigarette, to birds flying around a minaret, to a poem that's actually titled Self-Portrait as a Circle. Tell me more about this image.
It's funny. I think that comes from, there's a difference between writing a poem or trying to write a good poem. I don't claim that any of the poems in this book are good poems, because for me, my life goal is to write a single good line, let alone a single good poem. I think it's like a lifelong endeavor and goal to say one thing that's true. but they're exercises in truth, I guess. And basically this motif of repetition, the whole book is structured around repetition. And that came about for me laying out all the poems that I had and reading them and being really frustrated with myself because I noticed that there was just a ton of these repetitions. And my initial reaction to the repetitions is to sort of call them out, just to take them out. And I'm repeating myself. I need to come up with something else here. And then I said, wait a minute. There's something happening here that I might not have been aware of, but there's a kind of obsessive quality to these poems, and they seem to be just constantly striving to get at this kind of same thing obsessively. And so instead of taking out all the repetitions, I kind of leaned into them. And then I started purposefully writing poems that lean into the repetitions and that make repetition an important structural element of the book. So I feel bad that I don't have a more profound answer to the circle thing, but it actually comes from me trying to turn a weakness that I noticed in my work into a strength, which I think sometimes, a lot of times writers do. But it's an important moment in the act of writing when you have to distance yourself from what you've written, look at it from, kind of a bird's eye perspective and see what's happening there or how the text has escaped you and the meanings that it has produced while you weren't looking, while you weren't paying attention, while you were too busy with your, initial idea or initial intention with the poem. And so I realized that repetition could really be the organizing principle for these poems. And so I kind of leaned into it and started writing with that organizing principle in mind. And so there's this idea of constant repetition, obsessiveness, and also the idea of history that maybe doesn't repeat, but it does kind of rhyme. And this idea of constantly trying to return to a place that you can't really return to, like the idea of home as something that once you leave, you can't really go back, but you spend your life trying to. So that's where that circle comes from. And then I kind of really try to work it in to the poems and see where it worked and where it could sort of elevate the poem.
Yeah. I mean, the recursiveness comes through in these images, but also just structurally. I mean, you said that you were first frustrated to find that you were repeating things, but I thought one of the things that worked really beautifully about the book is that the people who populate the book, the characters, the lover, the family members, the mother, the father, the uncle, the aunt, they all come back in multiple poems kind of woven throughout the book. There's not letters to my mother section, but each different figure that you're kind of talking to or about almost gets their own form. I thought that that was really interesting. Can you tell me, like, for example, when you tell the story of your uncle or when you write of your uncle, becomes this sort of unreliably narrated prose series, and it's interspersed throughout the book. When you write about your mom, it's in the form of a letter to home. When you write about your father, you put him in these kind of little domestic vignettes that are very easy to visualize, and then he's this distant figure within that space. I'm going to stop talking now and let you talk, but tell me a little bit about how you have very, very distinct ways of speaking about each family member. How did you land on that?
Yeah, I think, once again, initially it wasn't conscious. It only became a self-conscious thing in the act of composing the whole book. And funnily enough, these poems, so there are 4 poems, No One Writes Home, 4 poems with the same title. And I put them in different parts of the book, and they kind of serve as markers to divide sections in the book. Not clearly, not really, it's not like a very clean-cut division of sections in the book, but it is a kind of transition from one section to the next. And initially, I was writing these poems. I was actually studying poetry. I was doing an MFA in poetry at BU. That's where I wrote a lot of these poems. And initially, the poems No One Writes Home were addressed to my brother, because I kind of had this kind of like longing to address my brother. And then as I wrote other poems, especially the poem Questions My Mother Will Never Ask, I realized that that's not my interlocutor. That's not who I want to talk to. And then this figure of the mother became important to me because I think this book really is a book about mothers and daughters in a way. It's about a lot of things. But for me, if you ask me personally, intimately, what this book is about, it's about the mother-daughter relationship. Because for me, it's the most complex and the most beautiful and the most mysterious relationship you can ever have in life. And the fact that I'm somebody's daughter is just, that's kind of the relationship that's most enchanting and perplexing to me, right? So I was sort of writing through it and writing through all of these questions I had about that relationship. And I think in those poems, you kind of feel this like longing for the mother to reply, which she's not going to, because the poetic voice is breaking the vow of silence, but not the people that she's addressing. So that's where the epistle form comes from. It's like, it's interesting because I have a friend, a wonderful poet, Jason Barry, who I highly recommend. He once told me of this anecdote that he had heard from some other guy, from some other poet, who said that, he doesn't believe in epistles as that a poem in the form of a letter sort of is not a poem and betrays what poetry is supposed to be. And first of all, I hate when people talk about poetry in these terms. It sounds smart, but it's actually so banal. And for me, it's the opposite. For me, every poem is a kind of letter to someone. Every poem is an attempt at communication. And this is what it has been for me from I started writing very early as this, lonely, solitary kid who was surrounded by a very small library and who had these books and who was trying to read a lot. And when I started writing, the act of writing for me really was an attempt to just communicate with the whole world. I just imagined the whole world is reading me and listening to me. So that's kind of what has stayed with me, that poetry is an attempt at a kind of dialogue. And so these epistles, these letters to my mother came out of that need to establish a connection and communication while knowing that it's impossible, right? Because I think poetry always exists in this space where we try to communicate while knowing that there's a kind of gap between humans and a gap between our solitudes that's never going to be bridged. And that's where poetry sort of comes from. So those poems are letters to my mother because I feel like that this is what the book is about. It's about mothers and daughters. As for my father, I believe I do mention a you there. I do kind of address, I have two poems, I think, addressed to. I say my father, but of course it's a creative work. It's a father. It's a father figure, right? So it comes from my personal experience, but also as a poet, I try to transcend personal experience, right? And when people talk about personal as political, I also think that they often talk about it in terms that are very self-indulgent and not particularly useful to me, because I think the point is to elevate the personal to the level of the political, not to sort of denigrate not to collapse the political into the personal, into the maybe trivial, right? So that's kind of what I try to do. I'm always trying to elevate the personal to a sort of more general level. So I like to speak of these as figures. So the figure of the father that's in the book, I think that there is a direct address to that figure, but there's also a distance there where I think the figure of the father is...
He's very mysterious.
Yes, very mysterious.
He's like in these scenes, in these intimate scenes with the daughter figure and the narrator figure, and he's kind of impossible to unpack. Actually, do you want to just go ahead and read?
Sure, yeah.
My father's skin looks like the surface of the moon.
This is one of the first poems that was published. I actually think this is the first poem that I published in English here in the US. My father's skin looks like the surface of the moon. They told you shrapnel made men celestial. That's why you joined the army. In midsummer, when weather vanes carousel, you pull your silence taut over our house. Nothing bad will happen to us now, not with you standing sentinel at the edge of our sleep, guarding against the peace thieves. In the living room, you and I mummify, waiting for the rains to pass. Dust settles on our eyelids, the choleric mahogany. Should you ever speak, I'd tie my hair to the hooves of your voice. I'd have my death by dragging out what the water dreams sunk. I'd ask if you've seen the moles in the garden, the bird nest under the eaves. I'd ask how many you captured. How many did you kill?
Thank you.
Yeah, so rereading this poem, I think what separates the speaker is really this experience that the father has that is impenetrable, kind of. You know, the act of war, the trauma of war, the fact that he was, you know, out on the front lines for I don't know how many years, all of the horrific things that you do in war that this speaker is trying to confront. But she only confronts them in the very last line. It takes her like the whole poem to get to that last line and the last direct question, how many did you kill? Which is also sort of kind of ambiguous because she talks about the nests under the eaves. So she's constantly trying to speak about this taboo of war and involvement in war. And I think when you're talking about war and war trauma, there's always a narrative of us, the victims, and they, the aggressors. And I think this speaker is doing something that's very controversial, which is broaching this subject of, well, how many did you kill? What was it that you did those 3 years? But I think that's why the figure of the father here is kind of mysterious and more distant, simply because there's something that separates, something unspeakable that separates the father and the poet or the poetic voice of this book. And I mentioned earlier that this book is a repudiation of silence and it is centered around the unspeakable and the unspoken. And I think that there are also unspeakable and unspoken things in the relationship with the mother as well, that these epistles, these letters are trying to kind of, bring to light and tease out. But I feel that this experience that the father has is just so extreme that it's kind of hard. I think it others a person in such a deep, fundamental way that, it widens this gap that the speaker is constantly trying to bridge. So that's why I feel that the poems addressed to the father, although there's a direct address and there's a direct view, still have that sense of more distance than the epistles and the conversation with the mother. And as for the uncle pieces, this was actually published as, I believe it was called a lyric essay. It was published in Michigan Quarterly Review, and it was just published as a single piece. And in the Bosnian version of the book, it was also featured as a single piece of writing. Here in the US, they called it a lyric essay. In the Balkans, they called it a prose poem. And it was the decision of my editor, the editor of the Serbian edition, this fantastic poet called Marija Dragnić, who I really hope gets translated into English soon and is read in English because she's just an otherworldly poet. It was kind of her idea to chop it up and then intersperse it throughout the book. And I really like that idea. And I sort of kept it in the English version as well. And one of the things that I like about it is that cutting it up diminishes some of the pathos in the piece. Like I was worried that the piece as a whole was sort of straying towards the pathetic a little bit. I mean, I'm not sure if it does or if it doesn't, but it speaks about, not to give any, spoiler alert, I guess, not to give anything away, but it deals with suicide. And so it's one of these pieces in a book that it's very emotionally charged. And I like the fact that we made this decision to cut it up and put these parts all throughout the book, because I feel that it's kinder to the reader as well. And I feel that it allows the reader to sort of absorb this story in a more, because I don't want to be a kind of poet who kind of emotionally manipulates her reader into tears or whatever. I want them to read with an informed mind. And I feel that this sort of helped it. But
weaves the story together with the other numbers.
Exactly.
It is this kind of recursive carousel with the different figures in the book all coming up kind of in succession again and again. And also because this is a suicide that is literally part of the leftovers of war, like grenade, it becomes something. It's so deeply entwined with the themes of the book that everybody is carrying these leftovers, whether physical, of war that kind of fluctuate between being suppressed and destructive.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the things that I liked about this decision is that it also added a kind of, what's that musical term? The word in English, something?
Contrapuntal?
Yes, very good. I know it in VCS, contrapunct, but I wasn't sure what it is in English. It kind of adds this, it disturbs the book a little bit, right? And a lot of people have asked me about the form. Why did you put this as a lyric essay? Why did you write this as a lyric essay? Or as I said, in the Balkans, it was branded as or marketed as a prose poem in the journal where it was published in a Croatian journal. And I don't have an answer to that question. I really just started writing this, and I guess I needed this longer breath to tell that story. And I can't really give any other rationale for it. And now that we decided to, break it into these smaller pieces, you get almost these vignettes that also tie together in a single narrative, which I like. And I feel that the book as a whole, I mean, these are poems, lyric poems, but also what I tried to do once I kind of figured out what kind of material I was dealing with, I also tried to put the poems in order and, write so that there's also like a narrative trajectory, so that there's a narrative arc. So I think this book is kind of a coming of age book as well, and a family history. And you follow this poetic voice as she, grows up. I don't really have a better word for it. So it has this quality of, I try to have both the lyric and the narrative element together in a whole, which was for me challenging because I've always identified very strongly as a lyric poet, and I've always identified strongly as a poet of short forms. And one of the things that I tried to do in this book is challenge myself to write longer poems that are much longer and that have a stronger narrative impulse behind them.
It's funny, a lot of different things that you've said lead me to the next thing I want to ask you about, and the next poem I want you to read. You speak about short form, about being strong in short form, and you also spoke about being just enchanted with the mother-daughter relationship. Would you go ahead and read the poem Matrilineage for me?
Matrilineage. One is mayhemed into threads, another weaves a mesh, a third collects. One tallies years on her wrists, another bends the bars, a third exits. One tucks a thorn under her tongue, another grows a throat, a third insists. One bites the fist that gags her mouth, another swallows teeth, a third hawks, speaks.
Thank you. I love how this one stands out sort of in the sound of it. It gathers power sonically in a way that reflects so well these three generations that coalesce in each stanza. I read something online that you did a lecture a few years ago where you talked about how literary canons erase and suppress the creation of artistic matrilineage. Can you tell me a little bit about who is in your artistic matrilineage?
Oh, that's such a good question. So many people and so many poets. I think my mother...
Recommendations.
Yes, a lot of them. I think my mother is the first figure there because I fell in love with literature because of my mother. She, when my brother and I were very young, she insisted on reading to us every night before bed. Books like Leslie's Coming Home, and which I actually forced her to read 5 times in a row. And it is at that moment that my brother lost all interest in literature, and I don't think he's ever read a book since then. So I take full responsibility for that catastrophe. But I was just, this is one of my earliest memories.
There's a great canon of dog literature, dog children's literature, but I have not heard of that one. So it's a book then?
Yes, and my mother read it to me in Bosnian Croatian Serbian, and I just cried bitter tears. And as soon as she'd finish, I'd say again, again, again. And I think my brother at that point gave up all literature. And I was all in, right? And then what my mother did...
I haven't been able to steel myself to read Sounder. That's that tragic dog book.
Oh, no.
My childhood to my children yet. But it's coming for them. It's coming for them, and we'll see.
Yeah.
It makes them poets or makes them never read again.
Yeah, he gave up not only on literature, I think he also gave up on dogs at that point. And he's been a cat man, and I've been a dog person ever since then. Not ever since then, but I became a dog person as an adult. But yeah, and then because I just loved reading so much, but I couldn't even read at that point. I was still like 5 years old. She'd do this thing on the weekends. She would record herself reading and then leave me these tapes so that while she was at work throughout the week, I would just listen to these tapes and listen to, like, lie down by the cassette player and listen to my mother's voice reading these stories until she came back home and could read one for me in person. So she really did a lot to nurture a love of literature. And because she also wrote poetry when she was younger, and then life just took her in a different direction. But another crucial moment for me was, I mentioned that we had a very small library when I was a kid, and my mother really was the only sort of literature person in the house. We lived with my paternal grandparents, my grandmother was literate, and my grandfather became literate later on in life. So it was a very curious mixture of my father's family, who were these, farm laborers, peasants from the interior, from this part of Serbia, and they had nothing to do with books. My dad was also just this working class guy who's his whole life who liked to read comic books, but that was pretty much it. And then my mother came in with this library, and she was the poet. And I was just surrounded by these books of hers, and I feel that she was trying to share this with her children because she didn't really have anybody else to share it with. And one of the things that I found in that library, because once I started learning how to read, I just I'd come back from school and I'd spend my whole day alone in this little room while my parents were at work and my brother was off at school. I was just picking out these books and just reading them at random. I read Pablo Neruda like very early on, and I of course didn't understand it. I had no idea what it was about. But it didn't matter, because for me, poetry was just sound. It was just this intoxicating sound. And I would just read these things over and over and over and over again. And one of the little books that I found was my mother's diary. It wasn't really a diary. It was more like, this book where she wrote her favorite poems and then had these little, pressed flowers and cutouts from magazines and different cutouts of poems from magazines that she loved. And it was basically like an anthology of my mother's, life or, her favorite poems. It also had a page right at the beginning where she detailed every kiss she ever had, the time and the place. And there was also that, which is also useful information. But other than that, it was mostly just this, very eclectic anthology of my mother's favorite authors. And a lot of them are Balkan poets like Vesna Parun, who is this Croatian poet whose poetry I read very early on. And again, I was too young to understand what they were saying, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was the sound, the melody. And for me, for very long, poetry was just pure sound. Even when I started writing it, it was just kind of pure sound. And it was only later that this other aspect of it came into view. So Vesna Parun was a very early influence. And then when I was in high school, I think that's when I discovered people like Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. And that opened up a whole other thing. Adrienne Rich became very important to me. So, the usual suspects, you might say. But there are a lot of poets today that I really love reading. There's also the Bosnian poet Ferida Duraković, who is, the godmother of Bosnian literature. And I have to say that I've been very lucky because I've had a very nice introduction to the literary world back home. I had these women writers, my colleagues were older than me. When I say older, I don't mean just biologically in terms of years, but further ahead in their careers than I was, who just kind of took me in and brought me into this world and really took care of me. And I'm so thankful for them. All of my first readings, first opportunities came from these women who really had this sense of obligation and duty to bring in this younger generation of women poets. And all I've received from them is just care and solidarity. And I don't know if this is a unique experience or not, but I know that, entering the literary world can be quite a traumatic experience. And for me, it was completely the opposite. I just had these women poets, women writers, not just from Bosnia, but also from Croatia and Serbia, who just showed me nothing but solidarity and kindness and care. And a lot of them became very good friends. I mentioned before my editor and now a good friend, Marija Dragnić. There's also Marija Dejanović. I also have to mention Monika Herceg, who is this wonderful Croatian poet whose book is actually coming out this fall in the US, published by Sandrov Passage. So I was really lucky to end up in this circle of just incredibly talented women who really helped me find my own voice. And I think this poem comes from that. When I was writing it, well, a thousand things were on my mind, as always. When you write, there's like 100 preoccupations and 100 things that you're thinking about. But I feel that this book is also my own personal anthology and a compendium and a kind of thank you to all of these women who have influenced me and my writing. And I feel at one point I was afraid that the book was too derivative. I read these poems and I asked myself, is there anything yours here? Is there anything new here? Something that's really yours and something that you can point to and say, that's me and that's not Marija Dragnić or that's not, Celia Plath. I actually do even quote Celia Plath a couple of times because I wanted to pay homage to this very early influence. And then I thought, you know what? I don't care if it's too derivative because I feel that all of the influences that are in this book are from these poets who have just meant so much to me and have really contributed to how I've developed as a poet. And then this poem, Matrilineage, that I just read, it also came out of an exercise in form. When I moved to the US, I started writing in English and I was playing a lot with English. I was playing a lot with the iambic beat of English. And this poem was written originally actually in English, and it just came out of me sort of experimenting with the form and the exigencies of the form and trying to have some fun. But it's a marriage of two different literary traditions because I'm trying out something sonically with the iambic beat, but I'm also in Matrilineage paying an homage to a male poet, Vasco Popa, who is also very important to me, and his short forms, his short lyrics. And so I'm kind of bringing in a lot of the heritage of Yugoslav literature and the Yugoslav literary tradition with the English prosody. So it's a little bit of a mongrel.
So the matrilineage goes even deeper formally because you're using mother tongue and adopted tongue and for this interplay. That's really cool. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about next was translation. One of the things, you said that you wrote this poem. This poem is kind of rare in the book because you wrote this one originally in English. The rest of the book you published first in your native language. Tell me, how long a gap was there between when you wrote the original book and then when you started to translate it? Was it published before you began to translate it into English, or how?
So this is a very interesting thing because I keep using the word interesting. A lot of these films were originally written in English, and I consider my work to be a work of translation and to belong to that tradition. So I speak fluently and I write in two languages, Bosnian and English, or Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and English. And this book exists in both versions, but I can't really tell you which version is the original and which version is the translation. I just actually saw a review that someone wrote about the book, about the English version of the book, and they talk about this poem and how it's different in these two languages, but they talk about the English version as the translation of the original, when in fact the English version was written first And then the Bosnian version is the translation. So I can't really, we usually talk about translation in these terms of original and translation. And for my book, these terms don't apply because all of the versions of this book that exist are translations. There is no original. The translation, I can only speak of which version was published first and which came second. But the version that was published first in Bosnia and Serbia is also a translation. A lot of it is translation and original writing. And then the English version also is, a lot of it was written originally English, but then there's also a lot of translation where there were a lot of poems. I had this crisis of faith, of poetic faith. And I stopped writing for a while. I even stopped reading. And then after the pandemic, I went back home for the first time to Sarajevo and finally gathered some courage to open the manuscript again. And once I did, once I started writing again, within about 2 weeks, these poems just kind of came bursting forth, which is very unusual for me because I'm a very slow writer and it takes me ages to write anything and to write a draft that I can then let go of and send it into the world. And then these poems just came out of me. And in 2 weeks, I had written 3 or 4 of them. And a lot of them were about the war, and I'd written them in Bosnian, and then I translated them into English. And this is how they ended up in this book. But there is no, if I take the Bosnian version and the English version, none of them are the original. They're both works of translation because for me, translation is really just writing. It's how I write. It's part of my writing routine and writing practice. And I actually recently found out about this concept in the Brazilian translation school from, I think the theorist is called Campos or something like that, of translation as transcreation. And that kind of applies to me, really. I don't see translation and writing as 2 separate processes. To me, they're the same process. And I write in 2 languages and I constantly switch between them. And the books that I write are always works of translation simply because I don't know how to write in any other way. So there are, if I look at the English version of the book, there's a group of poems that I kind of wrote in English and then they didn't change much. And then there's a group of poems that you could call your traditional translation, where I wrote them in Bosnian and then I translated them into English and didn't change them much. But most of the poems came from, maybe I wrote them originally in English and then I translated them to Bosnian, and then from translating them into Bosnian, I changed them also. I rewrote them because I figured something out or some new path opened up. And then from that rewritten version, I go back to the English version and rewrite that as well, or translate the rewritten one. Or I'd start writing something in English, but I'd use lines that I'd written earlier in Bosnian. I'd sort of, repurpose those lines and translate them into English and then put them into the poem. So there's really no, there are very few poems in this book that are sort of clear cases of a very traditional one-way translation between source language and source text, the target language and target text. Most of them are just a mess of going back and forth between these languages. And yeah, I don't know if people are going to think that this qualifies as translation or this qualifies as writing. I don't really care about these categories because I've never really, for me, translation has always been writing, and I don't distinguish between these 2 processes. It's just my creative process that entails 2 languages and sort of living in both and moving between both.
Yeah. So to hold both versions in your head at once as you're creating them. That's cool. I love this word, transcreation. I've got to read more about that. Very cool. Would you mind actually reading A Lover Learns My Tongue?
A lover learns my tongue. No open field or house made of windows. In this language you kneel, you scrape with your voice tar from the walls until it silts the roof of your mouth. The way the sun enters through the curtains, pawing on the unknown face on the bed, you too enter on tiptoe. Against you everything that won't let me go, against you armies and sirens bleeding red. Why is every language a funeral? Above our bodies pulped to dark, mustachioed verbs collapse their batons. Lay down your arms, pretend dead. When they come closer, kiss me with all of God's holy names.
Thank you.
I actually just remembered while I was reading A Lover Learns My Tongue. This poem came out of, it was also kind of an exercise, not an exercise in form as much as an exercise in thought and in ideas, a philosophical exercise. At this time, I was reading Clare Cavanagh's book on the lyric. And Clare Cavanagh is just this incredible translator of poetry. And there are things in that book that I disagreed with. But I was interested in her interpretation of the lyric as a form. And so this is a kind of a poetic response to that, or at least it started as a poetic response to that. And then it changed once I translated it into Bosnian. And once I translated it into Bosnian, I just felt that it was so boring and it just wasn't really working. And then, of course, I started changing it and then I started rewriting it. And then from that rewritten version in Bosnian, I translated it back into English in this form.
And it's funny how you talked about being a kid and starting with just the way the language sounded and eventually arriving at the different layers of meaning that a poem can convey. I mean, I feel like this translating back and forth, going back and forth between two versions really forces the issue to like a new depth, because you're looking at two different sounds, but you want a stable meaning between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, language is, if you're a poet and language is your material, and I think we become poets and we are poets because we love the materiality of language. So if you're moving between one language and another, it's not just, you're not just swapping the meaning of these words, but you're really engaging with the texture, the fabric of the language. That's what opens up the poem. That's what sort of leads me in different directions. And
you also can't just be seduced by something because it sounds good. There's always that too.
Yeah.
That line just sounds good. I can't cut that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's working meaning wise, but yeah, you really have to look at that.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, these poems, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking and what I wanted to say and blah, blah, blah. But I feel that whatever I say about the poems is going to be, or should be, hopefully, if they're okay poems, less interesting than what the poem says, and less interesting than what other people make of the poems once they read it. So I'm doing this PhD now in comparative literature, so I'm reading a lot of theory, and I've been doing that for 2.5 years now. And of course, I love reading and I love engaging with different ideas. And I'm not anti-theory. Of course, there's, it has its purpose, but nothing that any theorist can say could ever be, more fascinating to me than a well-written poem. That's why I'm a poet and not a theorist. But yeah, for me, it always starts with language, the materiality of language. And then that's my starting point.
You mentioned the materiality of language, and one of the things that is really front and center in your book is all these moments where poetry kind of feels like it comes direct from the body. You have lines like Nana hurls a throat full of syllables, your speakers cursed with heart-pumping dactyls, and this line especially I loved, words poetry taught me are like teeth. They are what they are. Like this last line is so great because it upends this platitude about poetry being like fierce and, efficacious or something like that, like political in this way. That, do you feel like the viscerality in lines like this and this thrust in the book imbues words with more power, or do you feel like you're revealing a weakness of poetry here?
Well, I think poetry works best when, I say this to my students very often, poems work best when you read them literally. Poems should be read literally. Other meanings can come later. But first of all, read a poem very literally and enjoy in the sound, enjoying the language, and enjoying what the language does and what this poem does, and then take it from there, right? And I feel that poetry is probably more effective when we approach it in that way, instead of approaching it from this abstract place. And for me, I had a lot of concepts, I had a lot of abstract ideas that I was thinking about and that I wanted to work, like weave them like throughout the book. There's this issue, I read this poem, Becoming a Homeland. There's this issue of nationalism, which is one of my biggest obsessions and preoccupations because it is just defined and determined so much of my life. understanding where this comes from. But and then there's the issue of the war, and then there's the issue of coming out and the identity and exile and all of these things, these very abstract things and ideas. And when I was writing these poems, I really struggled because for me, poetry, I guess, yes, some poetry is more abstract than other kinds of poetry, but the poets that I like the most are sort of, you use the word visceral, and I guess that's how I would describe it. And especially because when I was younger, the poets that I read the most, like the big Yugoslav poets, I mentioned Vasko Popa, but there's also Branko Miljković. They were just these, lyrical geniuses who were just capable of expressing their abstract concepts and very, difficult things in a language that was just so, I think reading them instilled in me this sense that a poem should be the end and the beginning of a world, right? That after you read a poem, nothing is ever the same again, that a poem changes or shifts you in some way, that the world that you knew before you read the poem is gone and dead, and the poem opens up a new way of seeing the world. So it's both like this moment of an end and a beginning at the same time. And they just wrote with such lyrical power and so much lyrical grace. And that's what I've always been striving towards. And for me, I got this question a lot back home from, journalists and from readers who were interested in the work. They would often ask me, because the poems are accessible. I don't think this poetry is particularly hermetic, but then it does have, these things happening in the very tissue of the poem. So they were constantly asking me, how do you achieve this balance between being understandable while still staying true to poetry as this very specialized form of expression? And I mean, for me, poetry is, I don't shy away from poetry being a difficult form of speech. It's supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to be a speech that's marked as, different from any other kinds of expression. That's the point of it. That's the beauty of it. And I feel that the challenge that it presents to the reader is a very worthwhile challenge. And people are constantly talking about, the death of poetry and how nobody reads poetry anymore. And I always kind of laugh at these pronouncements because poetry will always have its readers. It will always have people who seek this particular challenge and want to be confronted with this form of expression. So this is what I try to achieve in writing. I try to communicate, but I try to communicate in a way that poetry communicates, which is unlike any other form of expression and communication. And of course, it's a very embodied form of communication. My professor, Robert Pinsky, talks about this, that, we really put the poem in our body, sort of physically. You use the air from your lungs and you use your vocal cords and you use this little hollow that we call a mouth and you use a tongue to voice a poem, which is why I love also reading poems out loud. So it takes your body in order to vocalize these ephemeral little things that we call words. So it's embodied in a very practical way.
I love that. I mean, that's part of what the project of this podcast is about, is to embody it in a different way, or try to consume it in consume your poems in this kind of complete way where they become your own through memory. So that's I love that. I love that way of putting it. What was your education like in Bosnia? Was poetry part of your education in school or just in the community that you found? Was memorizing poetry any part of your education?
Both. Poetry was a big part of the curriculum, but also I come from a culture that really cherishes storytelling and song, a very musical culture. There's this stereotype about the Bosnians that they're excellent singers, that everybody in Bosnia can sing really well. And there are these regional, talent shows, singing talent shows. And people often joke how, everybody participates in these, the people from Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, but it's always the Bosnian who wins. I don't know how true that is, but it is a very musical culture. I'm not sure if I'm a particularly good singer. I can maybe carry a tune to an extent, but I come from a very also musical family. Everybody in my family plays an instrument or sings. And so there's that part. The musicality is just very dominant, a prominent feature. of my culture, but also oral poetry and epic poetry. I mentioned that my parents come from this particular part of the Balkans, that one of the things that it's famous for are these singers of tales, these epic poems, these poets, these bards, who, would sing epic poetry in these taverns. And my grandmother, for example, even in her late 80s, she could still recite entire chunks of epic poems that she learned when she was a kid in school. She was one of 7 children, and her father was very unusual because at that time when she was a child, it was very unusual I come from a Muslim family, and my grandmother was a Muslim, and it wasn't very customary to send Muslim girls to school. And her father sent her to school. Even though he also had a male child, he had a son, but he didn't send the son to school. They could only afford to send one child because they needed the rest to work on the farm, and he sent her, and then she taught all of her other siblings how to read and write. And I think she was probably one of the only women in her village, a Muslim woman who was literate. But throughout her life, even, into her late 80s, she'd spontaneously, we'd be sitting in our living room and she'd just start reciting these epic poems that she had learned from these songbooks when she was a kid. So it's a huge part of the culture, and it's something that I think is deep within me, this orality and this musicality. And poetry is of course, that's poetry, it's part of that. So I think I grew up in this culture of music and storytelling, and people would just sing all the time. I grew up in a household where my brother was constantly singing out loud, and any family gathering was a gathering with a guitar and a song. Well, it was really a singing competition because everybody was trying to outsing each other, but that's kind of how it goes. That's like your average Bosnian family coming together for, a barbecue. They just start singing, but they're also like competing with each other who can sing better. So yeah, that it's just part of my upbringing, and I'm very thankful that I grew up in that kind of world. And then yes, of course, in school, I finished elementary, secondary school, and also I did my undergraduate studies in Sarajevo in English language and literature and comparative literature, and I studied poetry formally, right? But I think I really became a poet once I did the MFA in poetry. And I know that, the MFAs have been criticized a lot for different reasons, and I share some of the concerns and some of those criticisms I also share. But for me, it was a transformative experience, really, because I had, 10 months of uninterrupted time to read and write. And it was only there in that room, in that classroom with 7 other wonderful, wonderful poets and classmates, and with my professors, Carl Kirchway and Robert Pansky and Nicole Seeley, that I actually, for the first time in my life, understood what it means, first of all, to write a poem, and also what it means to be a poet. And I think the former, for me, it became clear that a poem is a place of doubt. It's a place of uncertainty. It's a place where you're groping for, like, you're trying to figure something out. And the second is that a poet isn't necessarily a person who writes a poem. It's a person who can face her own defeat and take it on the chin and just move on and continue and persevere. That I think that's where I learned that to be a poet doesn't mean to just write, but it's really to persevere and to be able to face yourself at moments of your, most acute defeat, when you're staring either at a blank page or staring at something that you wrote that's just crap. That's just not very good, and you don't know how to make it better. And I've been through that process with so many of these poems where I would just cry because out of frustration, because I thought they're no good and I don't know how to fix them. I don't know how to make them better. And I think facing that moment of utter defeat and still persevering and sticking to it, that's what makes you a poet, I think. That's what I learned.
I think that just brings me back to why I love those lines about the circle farm, because it's not just that there's this recursiveness and this trying to get somewhere or not, but that you're cultivating that,
Right, exactly.
You keep on growing the circles, you keep on.
Yeah, you have to tend to the soil and, yeah, exactly. And I think one of the other things that not serious in terms of I'm such a good poet, but I'm so serious in my poems, right? I'm just so always serious. And I think people who know me who are not from Bosnia, who are not from the Balkans, always joke about what I call my resting Eastern European face, which is sometimes not very expressive, or sometimes I can come across as being, serious and angry, but I'm really not. And, I love humor and I love jokes and I love silliness and goofiness. But then I was reading these poems and none of that was in the poems. And I thought, where is that silliness and goofiness that I kind of have in my day-to-day life? And one of the things that I try to do, one of the challenges that I posed for myself is to make my poems kind of silly as well, or to imbue them with a little bit of, I landed in the end, playfulness, exactly, that's the word, with a little bit of playfulness. And also irony. I think irony is a saving grace a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with emotionally volatile material. Yeah. Try to Praise the Mutilated World by Adam Zagajewski. He was a Polish poet, and it was translated by Clare Cavanagh, who I've already mentioned. You asked me to choose a poem. I chose a couple, and then I changed my mind. I was thinking, what do I want to present to your listeners, and what poem do I want to talk about? There are so many that I wanted to bring in today, but I settled on this one for a very simple reason. This is like a personal prayer to me. This is the poem that echoes in my head and all the time. One of my professors at BU, the poet Nicole Seeley, in one interview, they asked her, what is poetry about? And she used this journalistic formulation that, the role of poetry is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think that this poem does that in the best possible way. And whenever I doubt whether poetry is worth it, whenever I look at the horrors of the world, and whenever poetry starts to seem so small and insignificant, whenever it's dwarfed by the terrible realities of the world, I come back to this poem. I think this poem is a reaffirmation of the need to speak, and the need to speak in this very special way that we do in poetry. And it's also one of those poems that, because I love the idea of this podcast, and I love the notion of people, being inspired to commit poems to memory, because I feel that it's so important, and it makes you experience the poem in a different way. And I mentioned before that for me, the musicality of poetry, the sound of poetry, has always been the most super important, and this has always been my starting point. And I memorize poems through sheer sound, through sheer melody. Melody as this, very powerful mnemonic device. And I read this poem so many times, and I have this, the rhythm of it and the melody that I constructed in my head as I'm reading it, it just stayed with me. And so it's one of the poems that I know by heart, which is why I also wanted to share it with you today. I think when you asked me which poem, I replied to you without checking the title of the poem. I think I wrote, "You should praise the mutilated world," but the title is actually "Try to praise the mutilated world." This sentence repeats a few times throughout the poem. The first line is, "Try to praise the mutilated world." But then we have, "You must praise the mutilated world." And then later we have, "You should praise the mutilated world." And escalates. Yeah, and I like how the poem is trying to convince itself of something, or how it kind of oscillates between certainty and uncertainty. It starts with try, which is very modest, try. We're not sure if you're going to succeed or not. And then it mentions one of the horrific things. It mentions the abandoned homesteads of exiles. And then right after that is this imperative, "You must praise the mutilated world." And then as it goes deeper and as it recounts more and more horror, it oscillates and it goes back to "you should." It's a difficult thing to sing of a world that's so merciless, but maybe we should do it. And then it ends with "praise the mutilated world." Suddenly there's no more modal verbs are out. There's no must or should, but it's just a simple "praise the mutilated world." And it's this process of the poem convincing itself, or, oscillating between certainty and uncertainty. That's also what I go through as a poet, believing in poetry and believing that it's the most important thing in the world. And then also having moments where I think, we're just doing this useless, trivial little thing while so many are suffering, and that it doesn't really matter. This is why I hold this poem very sort of near and dear to my heart and just kind of carry it with me in my head, just echoing in my head all the time. So maybe I'll try to read it for you.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Selma.
So again, this is by Adam Zagajewski and translated by Clare Cavanagh. Try to praise the mutilated world. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns.
Thanks again to Selma Asotić for talking about your work and for sharing this poem with us. Adam Zagajewski's poem here was written with memories of his war-blighted Polish childhood in mind, but it first appeared in The New Yorker the week after the World Trade Centers fell, published into an indelible dialogue with the September 11th attacks. That is a heavy mantle for a poem. I'm going to divide this poem up into 3-line stanzas, and we will move across it as it reframes seasons, senses, and poetry as acts of defiance.
Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine.
These first lines, they make me think of that Nancy Sinatra Lee Hazelwood duet. How could they not? There are strawberries, there's wine, it is spring. I mean, except for the foregrounded reminder that the world, despite all its sweet, sensual pleasures, is fundamentally mutilated. Let's repeat it again.
Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine.
Let's move on to the next stanza, where the detritus of war coexists with nettles, weeds that are very good at self-protection.
The nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world.
Like Selma mentioned, the injunction to love the world grows firmer as the poet changes his try to a should. On to the next stanza, where we zoom out to a more global, watery vision of luck and devastation.
You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others.
Let's move on.
You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world.
If in Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts we should be shocked by the executioner's horse, blithely ignoring an execution as he scratches his behind on a tree, here it is the executioner himself who is crassly sensual in the face of suffering.
You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world.
Since the ship and the executioner and the general juxtapositions of this poem do bring Musée des Beaux-Arts to mind for me, it makes me think of Zagajewski, standing before paintings contemplating the same themes Auden did with his old masters. In Zagajewski's poem Self-Portrait, he writes, "Sometimes in museums the paintings speak to me, and irony suddenly vanishes." On to the next few lines where the verbs flattered and flared move from the physical world of the past to the flutterings and flares that fire off in the private electrical spaces of a mind remembering.
Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared.
And here is just a 2-line sentence. Autumn is closing, and the generalized mutilation of the world has mellowed to scars in soil, and mellowed even farther, with the leaves falling, the earth layering back onto itself with the passage of time.
You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars.
And what better nod towards future hopes than the acorn, with the hope of an oak tree inside? Let's do those lines again.
You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars.
Here in this final section, where the injunction is firmer and in spite of the sparse wintry imagery, we know we must see what is before us and love it.
Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns.
Let's hear the whole thing through once more.
Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns.
And that was our poem. I hope it unfolded for you in a way which made you glad to make it your own. And I hope you can hold on to it, review it on paper, or let it live more like a song in your memory. Thank you to Susie Boyd for lending me this podcast's title, to G.W. Sock and the X for use of their song, The Art of Losing, which borrows the words of Elizabeth Bishop. And thank you to my sound engineer, Alex.
Disaster.